happened twice.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now we've just got time for a brief panel discussion. Might first see if any of the speakers have questions for each other.
Actually, I have a question for Yann. I liked a lot your idea of the... I should put this thing on somewhere?
It's on, I think. But
it's on? Okay. Sure. I like your idea of designing the objectives to representing the morals or the ethics of the machines. But typically, ethical principles are very abstract, and machines are trained for very practical, functional things. And there is a whole link between discrimination or privacy.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Sorry. There is a lot of a big distance between the concept of privacy or the concept of discrimination or the concept of safety and the very practical functions that the systems are built on. How you would propose to bridge that distance?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's not a solved engineering problem. There's no recipe of how you design those objective functions. And presumably, you can imagine the Asimov 3 laws of robotics could be kind of an example of those objective functions, but I never like them because they're not operational. They're not something you can sort of reduce to an objective that a machine can optimize. So you have to find substitutes of that achieve the same goal, but at the same time are easier to kind of implement, if you want. Now, for the question of which is kind of a more short-term ethical question about AI and machine learning, which is the issue of bias. That's not a question necessarily of designing the objective function of the machine. It's more of a question of what's the appropriate data to train it on. So a learning machine will reflect the biases that are present in the training data that has been used to train it. And we've seen examples of some small companies that are not very experienced with the process of doing this, making very stupid mistakes in training AI systems with reflect the biases in their data, and predicting that crime recidivists. There's some systems like this, as some cities have bought to predict the rate of recidivism for particular people, and they're biased against people with dark skin. And so there are mistakes like this that people shouldn't make. So one of the goals of the partnership on AI that David was alluding to earlier, some of the other founding members are in the room here, Francesca from IBM. One of the purposes of this partnership for AI is to define perhaps guidelines and ethical guidelines of how you build AI systems so that they're not systematically biased, they don't reflect the worst aspects of society.
Okay, time for some questions for the group. Okay, there's one there. Go ahead. Yep, Adam.
100,000 years ago, there was a conference of Neanderthal-like creatures, and it was called the Ethics of Modern Human Intelligence. And they were very worried about being outcompeted by humans, and they raised all sorts of concerns. But now when we look back, maybe they really ought to have been outcompeted, and maybe it was a good thing. So when we worry about the future of artificial intelligence, what do you think about the possibility, or the depressing possibility, that we ought to start preparing ourselves for dinner in the distant future? Because if we're worried about multiple emulations, maybe they ought to have more votes than us. Is that possible that, what's ethical with respect to artificial intelligence when it's sufficiently smart is just a question we ought to ask it?
Well, there's room between the claim that we have reached the maximum of what is valuable and the claim that whatever happens is valuable, or whatever is the most intelligent is valuable. It might be that there's a huge space of possible minds, possible modes of being, possible types of lives and experiences, and that with our human wetware, we can explore a tiny corner of that vast space of possibilities. And in this much larger space, there might be some that are more valuable and a lot that are less valuable. And what we then would have reason to do is to try to find a trajectory that eventually leads to one of the more valuable regions. It doesn't mean that just because something is smarter than us, therefore it would be a good thing if it took over. You could have, I think, a superintelligence who's, to take the classic example in this domain, whose only goal is to make paperclips. So you have a paperclip maximizer, and it's very, very good at it, and it produces a world which is full of paperclips and nothing else except machinery to make more paperclips. By the metric of intelligence, it would be far superior to us. It might have the brain the size of a planet. And yet, in terms of plausible accounts for what has value, it would be inferior to us. It might not even have any internal mental life. The question remains, even if you think that there could be ways of existing that would be more valuable than our present ones, we still have to put in work to ensure that we reach those. And I think, to me, a plausible account would be that the future is very big, that there's this enormous Petri dish out there, that we could have space both for fantastic continuations of the 7 billion people who happen to live now, and also for all kinds of new exotic super beings that we should first make sure we satisfy all legitimate, easily resource-satiable preferences. If we can do that with a small fraction of the total, and then we can have a discussion as to how we use the rest of it, what additional things could be built.
So the interaction between two intelligent entities with different capabilities is something we're actually quite familiar with already. First of all, inside of our own brains, right? So we have, or let's say, our reptilian brain that basically, has all those kind of low-level drives that makes us feed and etc. And then the cortex on top of it that essentially is subservient to it, even though it builds on top of it, is subservient to it. And so you can imagine that AI systems would be kind of a an exocortex, if you want, that is subservient to our brains, but extends its intelligence the same way our cortex extends the intelligence of a reptilian brain. So Gary Marcus, is Gary here? He's not here. Oh, here, okay. So, it has this little book. We disagree on many things, he and I, but it has this nice little book called Kludge where, he described this example of, you're in front of a piece of chocolate cake and your reptilian brain says, go for the calories, and your, frontal cortex, which can do long-term prediction, says, wait a minute, this is actually not good for you in the long term, so you shouldn't go for it. And sometimes your reptilian brain wins. So I think it would be kind of the same thing in our relationship to AI systems. They will probably do a much better job at doing world prediction. Right now they're terrible, but eventually they might be good at it. So they might do a good job at predicting what's going to happen next, and that will allow us to make better predictions. But in the end, hopefully we'll be in control. It's not very different from the way we use computers today, right? We have large supercomputers doing weather prediction, and they are used as a world model, as a world predictor, as a world model, from which we can make decisions. So I don't think it would be qualitatively different from the interaction we have today. Also, I don't know about you, but as a manager of an industry research lab, I'm very used to interacting with people who are way smarter than me, and I'm their boss, right? So.
Thank you all. This question's for Yann. It can be open to the other two speakers. I was just thinking of your predictions in the face of uncertainty and the kind of prediction ribbon in the graph, and then I was thinking about the video and imagery predictors that you showed, and I was just wondering with regards to, say, evidence in courts in the very applied case of criminal justice. At what point would you be comfortable with that being used as an application of evidence in terms of predictions of facial models when it comes to CCTV footage and et cetera?
Right. So, there's a lot of different questions there. So, certainly there are pattern recognition, vision, AI systems today that can be used for, forensic purposes, How they'll be accepted as evidence in court, I have no idea. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm really not a specialist of those questions. But perhaps the same way DNA evidence is, which is kind of statistical in nature, is also accepted, or photographic evidence, which has diminishing value now that we can kind of tweak photos and stuff like that. In terms of like the ability to predict, basically what forensics is about is retrodict. You observe a state of the world, and you have to deduce a sequence of actions that led to the state of the world, essentially, right? You get to a crime scene, and you have to figure out what happened. So it's retrodiction of prediction. But it's the same problem. It's really very much a very similar kind of problem. Will machine help us in this? Not anytime soon.
Hey, question for Yann, probably, sorry, popular today. So if we have an intelligent machine and its primary leash is a reinforcement to specific trainers, wouldn't the easiest way to get that reinforcement to be to put a gun to the head and force the positive signal?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yes, so you suggested a mechanism for control for an intelligent machine is to assign specific trainers that the machine will crave positive feedback from. That was in one of your slides. So my question is, wouldn't the easiest way to get the positive feedback or to get them to push the button would be to put a gun to their head?
Well, I mean, one of the statements I made is that I thought reinforcement learning was actually a relatively minor way of training machines. It's a relatively minor way of training humans as well. So there's very little that we learn as humans that is conditioned by reward and punishment. Most of what we learn is, the vast majority of our knowledge is through this, possibly, it's a hypothesis, of course, there's no proof of this, but it's through this prediction and sort of modeling the world, which is task independent. And then on top of this, you learn a task, perhaps using reinforcement or supervised learning, and that if you have the proper representation of the world that has been built through unsupervised learning, then learning those tasks is very quick and requires just a few examples. So this is what is surprising today. That's what creates the difference between the amount of samples that are necessary to train a supervised system today, which is thousands, whereas you show 3 pictures of an elephant to a child, and the child has figured out what an elephant is. So it's because there's a vast amount of knowledge that the child can build on top of. It already has good representation of the visual world. So yeah, I'm not sure I answer your question, but I see reinforcement as kind of playing a relatively minor role.
Okay, let's take one from Paul quickly.
I hate to return to this theme, but I continue to have the impression that the role of consciousness is being downplayed. So for instance, when you said, look, should we be morally worried about disconnecting them? Well, we could build them in such a way that they don't care about being disconnected, and then somebody rightly pointed out that it might be just part of the functioning to have a certain kind of functional instinct for self-preservation. The question is, if it has the functional instinct for self-preservation, Apple could easily design my laptop so that whenever I touch the off button, it said, ouch, don't turn me off, and so forth, and exhibited all kinds of seemingly caring about being turned off. The real notion of caring about being turned off is one that appeals to the notion of consciousness, which has been left out of the discussion. So I think all of these issues about whether we ought to have complicated moral views about how to treat systems turn on notions of consciousness which have not yet been figured out. Certainly the epistemology of saying whether a unit, especially one that's functionally quite complicated and intelligent in some sense, is conscious or not, has not been settled. And I think before we do that, we can't really address these questions in a correct way.
Well, so we have no problem going through anesthesia, which is, essentially indistinguishable from death, except it's reversible. And so, somehow, so that's the first point. Second point is, there's a lot of small animals who clearly fear being turned off, who I think most people would say are not conscious. or maybe they are. It depends on your definition of consciousness. So third of all, I don't know how to define consciousness. So that kind of makes this question very difficult for me to answer. But if I had to make a guess as to what people think of as consciousness, is perhaps the ability to, of this prediction system I was I was talking about, to see yourself as part of the world, right? So you kind of observe yourself in your world simulator. The world simulator includes yourself, and so you have this feeling of observing yourself, from the outside. Why is that qualitatively different? I mean, why is there, some new sort of moral question about this particular effect in an intelligent machine? I'm not sure why there would be. Bottom line is basically I don't see the problem.
I think consciousness probably, as like many other aspects, there is gradations to it. There will be I agree that I don't know how to define consciousness, but there will be very many different levels of consciousness, from it making us believe that it's conscious, to simulating consciousness, to the full consciousness like we attribute to each other. So somewhere there in between will be the machine consciousness.
I think.
Sorry.
Hi, thanks so much. This is a follow-up on some things that Professor Dignum was saying, but I think everyone could chime in on it. It's about accountability and transparency.
Mm-hmm.
So if a machine learning algorithm has selected me as someone that the police should stop, we might think that I have a right to ask why I was selected.
Yeah.
But it also seems like the more powerful and efficient the algorithm is, the more complicated it will be, and the harder it will be for us mere humans to have really any grip on why it's making any particular decision based on 10,000 different parameters. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit to the trade-off between transparency and accountability, and how powerful and intelligent these things are.
Yes, you're right. Indeed, the more complex the algorithms are, the more difficult it will be for it to be transparent. However, making them more complex and more efficient in the operations they are trained for is maybe not always the way to go. We have to make a trade-off between optimal operational function and transparent operation. And I think that trade-off is where we have to look at in designing those algorithms. And now we are mostly designing the algorithms from the operational efficiency. And that, yeah.
There has been a lot of discussion of artificial intelligence itself operating as a moral judge, as a moral system. But the more pressing question and the immediate question is, on what basis should we decide what kinds of choices and decisions to delegate to automated systems? And what safeguards or what conditions on the operation of those systems are required by moral standards that we ourselves are going to use. And I would just like to ask the panel whether they think that that issue, that this question, is necessarily going to involve some attribution or design of moral judgment in the systems themselves. I don't think that that's obvious. it may be that all of the moral work will have to be done by us. And just by way of analogy, there is a much older technology of delegation of choices to a quasi-automated procedure, which has been extremely important, and that is the legal system. And about the design of the legal system, these questions are very important. What should be the moral standards that we use in deciding to turn over to a set of largely automatically applied rules certain important decisions? And that kind of delegation has been a vital aspect of human civilization.
Yep.
Now, in the legal system, the parts of the machine that carry it out are human beings. And sometimes, at least in common law systems, they have to make moral judgments themselves. But a great deal of the legal system is just carried out automatically. And I would like to know why you think, if you do, that AI, if it is given authority to make some choices, is going to have to operate sometimes like a common law system with moral judgments being made by the machines.
I think part of that connects to an earlier question, and one distinction is whether the domain of application is the same or known to be very similar to the domain of testing. So in the limiting case, you have a set of points that you might want judgments over, and you can randomly select some and see how the algorithm works on those. And then you can statistically have guarantees that with a certain likelihood, it will operate within the wider domain from which you randomly sample. And there you might just want accuracy from the algorithm, and you can have fairly strong guarantees that it will behave as you intended. But if you intend to apply it outside the domain in which you can test its performance, then you need to have some understanding of how the system works in order to be able to guess how it will extrapolate from the cases it has seen. And if you can't have that kind of guarantee, then you would want to have the ability to revise it, to supervise it, to go in and change its decisions.
There's a funny thing, which is that in certain languages we call the law the legal code, right? And it's not by accident. It's code in the same way as a program is code. That we call a computer program code. So it's basically a set of rules that implement a combination of two things. One is in the little diagram that I showed, where you have the objective, which encodes the moral value. You give it a state of the world or a sequence of things, of actions, and it tells you whether it's good or not. And then there is the agent that tells you, produces actions that are according to this objective or not. And legal code, I think, is a combination of the two. So it's it's a way to define an objective function for people in society, to make people behave in certain ways. So it defines the objective function for people in some ways. That's why there are incentives and punishment, basically, in the legal code. So it's kind of a substitute objective function that makes it such that when people optimize this objective function, they ultimately maximize the common good, if it's designed properly. Of course, it's very difficult. But you're right, it's very similar. I mean, I see it in very, very similar terms, except legal code applies to societies, which are collections of people, whereas the objective I was talking about applies to a single entity or a single AI entity, and we have kind of a similar modules in our brain that sort of is our moral fiber, if you want.
Okay, final quick question right here.
Yeah, this is a quick question. I was just wondering, so instead of kind of prescribing these more general, objective, moral claims to a machine, is it possible that we could sort of use this system of neural networks to upload, if you will, or dump, I guess, the history of philosophy or moral theory more in general, and have the machine conclude on its own what might possibly be the best philosophical or ethical conclusion or standard to then hold other machines to, if you will?
Right.
You'll find there the same bias as in other. People don't agree as well between cultures or between different people on the morality of many actions and on the concrete translation of moral principles into actions. So I think if you would take that line of that approach, we would find the same kind of bias in the decisions that the machines take as what we find now in bias in profiling and whatever. But it's an interesting approach to consider.
So I think there are two parts to philosophy. I mean, whatever I can see. The one is the sort of model of the world part, which is, you know, if we behave in such a way, here is what's going to happen in the long term. Like, why is it, you know, good to have, I don't know, democracy or something like that, or, you know, sort of general principles that organize behavior. What would that lead to in the long term? So that's the issue of predicting what a particular type of behavior will produce. Will it be good in the long term or bad in the long term? And a lot of the issues, political issues that people disagree on, is basically differences in prediction of what's going to happen in the long term, or differences in weighting of short-term versus long-term objectives, like, you know, climate change or things like that. And so I think yeah, I guess I'm going to stop here. Let Nick speak.
Well, if there is going to be machines that surpass us in general, cognitive abilities in all domains, then I think it casts a new light on intellectual priorities. So there's a bunch of problems that we could defer to the more capable reasoners that we think might exist in the future. That would include a lot of moral reasoning, insofar as we think that there are progress that can be made by thinking about moral questions. That progress could be made better and faster and easier with these machines. So the task then becomes to isolate a subset of problems that we need to solve ourselves first, either because they are very pressing or because we need the answers to those questions in order then to be able to create this superintelligence in the right way. And all the other problems that we don't need to have solutions to between now and then, I think, have reduced urgency and can maybe be delegated to the future. And so I argue for this principle of delegation, which is that when possible, with a lot of qualifications, we could sort of defer a lot of these detailed judgments to the more efficient minds that will exist in the future. And we shouldn't beg the questions. We shouldn't sort of lock in our own possibly flawed guesses about factual matters. If we could instead leave that open to be revised and analyzed more efficiently by the better minds that we might build.
Okay, we've gone over time, so we better end it there. Go eat at one of the many fine restaurants nearby and be back here at 1:30. But let's thank all of our speakers for a great discussion.